curious, have you ever sat and listened to a story about somebody, maybe somebody who's had great success or somebody who has achieved a lot, no matter what it is. And as you watch it and as you listen to it, you kind of come to this point where you realize they're not all that different than you. I don't know what it is, but maybe you've got things that you have in common, and you kind of have this connection with them. And it could be something as simple as you went to the same school, or they're from, the town that you grew up in, or maybe maybe they had some of the same experiences as you. They may have faced some of the same trials or oppositions, or there are different things that they faced or gone through that you went through as well. And so you form this connection. Anybody ever had one of those that you look at somebody like that? See, that's one of the reasons I love history. I really do. I love to study history. I love to get a lot of the backstory on people, because when I do, what I find a lot of times is that I have a connection with them. There are things that you learn. You're doing something and you learn something about this person. Somebody you look up to. It may be an inventor. It may be maybe an athlete. Maybe a philanthropist. Somebody like that. An astronaut. And they've done these amazing things that you look up to them. But come to find out, the more that you dig in, you find that they're not all that much unlike you. That in a lot of ways we tend to look at them as heroes and see that there's something else. But the fact is that a lot of times they had the same upbringings. They just made a few decisions, or in some situations or in some circumstances that maybe we didn't. And I think that it's a great opportunity for us to evaluate. The more that I learn about other people, the more I learn about myself. There's an old saying that those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. And it's very true. And we see that in the lives of people. And I think a lot of times when we read these and we find out that somebody who did something amazing was an awful lot like us, it just kind of raise our sights. It gives us a little bit different perspective. Because instead of looking at them so much as saying, well, they just got lucky, or the fact, well, they're a better person than I am, we start to see that no, they're not. They in a lot of ways were just like me. Okay? Now, the other side of that coin is that has anybody ever watched on A&E? There's a show called Intervention. Anybody ever watched it? No. It's a pretty good show. And what it is about it's a story about people that are struggling with addiction, and it's their families that they love, and they are trying to get them into treatment. Okay. But one of the things I got to thinking about is, whenever I watch it, they always, through the course of it, because you can't fill the whole show with that, so they do a lot of backstory of the people and tell about them. And what I realize is that in a lot of ways, some of them had the same upbringing as me. In a lot of ways, a lot of them, they had the same kind of young adult life that I did, except for that there may have been one or two. There was kind of instances or circumstances, a situation or a decision that they made that kind of changed the trajectory of their life. And I have to look at it a lot of times and say, you know what? There, but for the grace of God, go I. Okay? And so as we're looking at the lives of other people, I think that we can learn a lot about ourselves. And that's one of the reasons, honestly, I think that the Bible is written the way that it is. I know that we agree the Bible is the inspired Word of God. It is spoken by the Holy Spirit and recorded by men and women. But I think that there is a reason that it includes the accounts that it does. Well, actually, there's a couple of reasons it includes the accounts that it does. Number one, because the accounts that are contained within the Bible, in this book, are history. They are real life events that took place in the lives of men and women. Okay, that's first and foremost. But there's another reason, and I think it is because what you read in here are real life events. You think I'm just saying the same thing twice? No. They are real life events in the lives of men and women. And so we get to see in them things that we can learn from. I mean, think about it this way. Yes, the Bible is the inspired word of God. But it could have been shorter if it just all was kind of like Proverbs, couldn't it? I mean, if it was all like Proverbs and just said you should do this and here's why, and you shouldn't do this and here's why, I think it would have been a whole lot easier and a whole lot more straightforward. But why is it not that way? Because in the lives of these men and women, we find them making decisions. We find them facing things. We find them coming up situations that we ourselves can learn from. And I get it. I mean, I read the Bible, and I find that although they may have been born thousands of years before me, they may have lived on the other side of the world. They were in a different culture. They were in a different time, under a different government, speaking a different language, wearing different clothing. They were people, though, just like me. They had the same worries, same fears, same doubts, same frustrations, same temptations that I have. They were just like me. And that's why we're doing this. We're starting off, excuse me, and we are going to do kind of a year-long type series. Obviously not going to be the entire year we're going to go through, but we are going to be doing exactly this, character studies of people in the Bible. Okay, we're going to do a character study. We're going to learn about where they were born, when they were born, situations and circumstances that they were in. We're going to talk about events in their life that they would probably love to be remembered for. And we're going to talk about some of the events that I'm sure they wish we would all forget about. Okay? Because I think that in those we learn a lot about them. Because here's kind of my hope. One, a lot of times we will read an account, we pick a story out of the Bible, we go through it, and we take just that moment, and we pick it apart, and we say, oh, good choice, bad choice, see what they did, this ties to that scripture. But I think sometimes we need to step back and take the big picture view, because it is bigger. It's an entire lifetime that has gone into these events. And so we're going to look at some of these people, defining moments in their lives, some of the things that they went to. And my hope is that as we do that, we can begin to see how it was that God did such amazing things through such ordinary people. I mean, we look at heroes of the Bible and, heroes of the faith, and we think of them as being larger than life and bigger than us. But the fact is, they were people just like us, weren't they? I mean, we read it in hindsight. I'm curious. Okay, have you ever looked at somebody? It's just a question, because I think we do this. You see these famous people. I don't care if they're actors. I don't care if whether they're talking about athletes, whether you're talking about teachers. You see somebody, and you look at them, and don't you? Sometimes we almost look up to them. We think that they're somehow, because of what they did, they're a little bit better. And some of them think because of where they are that they're a little bit better than us. But just what I'm saying is that we sometimes look at them that way. But if you really dig in, what you find is that a whole lot of them, so they were just like you. They had they had the same struggles. They had the same things going on. And it's the same way when we look through the Bible. And here's really my goal in a lot of this. I would like for us to be able to, and as we go through this, I would like for us to be better able to see ourselves in the Bible. Now, what I mean is not to mean that we are now the star, okay? That's not it. And I'm not saying not in any way that somehow we are to see the Bible as being just about us, that it was written all about us, because that's not the case. The Bible is what? It is the story of the glory of God. It is God's unfolding plan of redemption. But what I would like us to be able to do is to see ourselves in the Bible and to be able to look at it and understand how it is that God did, through such ordinary people, such extraordinary events. And also, as we do it, to be able to look at it and realize that a lot of the names that get thrown around, that you hear in sermons, that you read them in songs, you see them in Christian conferences, in leadership seminars, in devotions, and in all of this stuff, that those people, those names that get thrown around were men and women just like you and me. But because of what they did, because of decisions they made, we look at them today and we call them heroes of the faith, heroes of the Bible. So today we're going to start with the one that was the most requested of all of them, which, by the way, if you have a suggestion, if you have somebody that you would just love to have a study done on, okie doke. Write it on a connection card, because everybody fills those out, and then place it back there in the tray on your way out. Or you can send me a message, comment on Facebook. If you're watching on Facebook and you're like, "Ooh, I'd love to hear," then just type that in right now. And so, or send me an email, or give me a call up here. Either way, I have most of this mapped out, but I did leave room for input. So if you've got somebody, send it to me. They may already be in the queue, or they may get in the queue, or they may not. So just in all transparency there. Today we're talking about Peter, which if you paid attention, you know that. Okay. Peter, as we know, that was not his given name. His actual given name was Simon. Okay. Just a little bit about him. Peter was the name that was given to him by Jesus. We find it in Mark records it, Luke records it, John records it as well. That his name was Simon. But he came to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John," which, now, depending on translation, sometimes that's son of Jonah. Those were interchangeable. "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, when translated, is Peter. Cephas is the Aramaic. Peter is the Greek. A little bit about what he did and who he is and who he was to Christianity. Peter is considered to be the author of 1st and 2nd Peter, letters written by him. In the same way, he is also considered to be, by some, the source material for Mark, meaning that John Mark actually wrote it, but John Mark was not one of the disciples. And so there's a lot that believe that John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, and that it is largely from Peter's accounts and Peter's recollection, okay? Just a little tidbit, that will be on trivia. So, back to Peter. Who was he? Peter, we know he had a brother named Andrew, okay? Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist, okay? And we know that because Andrew was following John the Baptist. In fact, he was at Bethany along the Jordan River when one day Jesus came walking by. John the Baptist says, "What? Look, the Lamb of God." And so when he did, then Andrew, they ask a question, and so Andrew, and he begins to then follow Jesus. Now, he goes, though, first thing he does, what's he do? He goes and gets his brother Simon, his fishing partner, and his brother. So he goes and he gets Simon, brings him to Jesus. That's where we read that he says, "You are Simon, son of John." For a little bit, we know that Peter, Andrew, his brother, Philip, and Nathaniel, they followed Jesus, but it also is pretty apparent that for a while, Peter went back to his fishing business. And the reason we say that is because about 8 to 9 months later, we see what is referred to as the second call of Peter. And so we know that they left, but the second call then is when Jesus comes back. We find it in Matthew 4. It's also in Luke 5. And we're going to kind of come back to it in a little bit. But from that point, we find that Peter, Andrew, Philip, and Nathaniel, among others, are constant companions of Jesus. Okay? Peter is probably the most well-known of all of the disciples, the apostles. Had a position of leadership. He is mentioned more than any of the others, and is also considered to be part of the inner circle of Jesus. which I know it sounds a little odd to say that Jesus had an inner circle. Jesus had many circles, actually. Uh, if you look, he had his followers, which was a big group. And it was a group that kind of grew and got small and grew, kind of like Twitter. He got a whole bunch of followers, and then he said the wrong thing. Bam, they were gone. Really did. You'll read that. It's in there. So he had all these followers, and then he had what we call the disciples. Okay? Now, the disciples are the 12 that we always think about, okay? The 12 that were with him all the time, that they traveled with him, they ate with him, they were there at all of his teachings and preachings and all of that stuff, okay? Peter was one of those, but we also know that then there was an inner circle. There was a circle of 3, 1 times 4. Andrew was in there 1 time, but we go. Peter, James, and John were the inner circle that spent most of, they were really... they experienced things that nobody else did. Okay, there's a couple of times here that they were participants. They were witnesses when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. Okay, they were also the 3 that were there at the Transfiguration. They were also the 3 that were there, excuse me, when he is, Transfiguration, yeah, man, I lost it there for a second. They were also at the Garden of Gethsemane. And so you have these 3, this inner circle that were there during those times when nobody else was, okay? And so... we have to kind of look at them as different in the relationships that they have. But I was kind of, think about this. Here is Peter, okay? He's this guy from a little town called Bethsaida, okay? He's a fisherman by trade. He's uneducated. He's untrained in any particular way, okay? And so one day, he is called by this Jewish rabbi, a Jewish rabbi who does miracles nonetheless, but he's called by this Jewish rabbi to be one of his followers, to be one of his disciples. And then, even beyond that, he gets ushered into where now he becomes part of this inner circle of 3. I mean, but the fact is that when it was all said and done, Peter was a guy just like you and me, wasn't he? I mean, he was. He was just a little guy. He was a guy from this little town called Bethsaida over in Galilee. He was, like I said, he was a fisherman. He was living under Jewish rule. He was looking forward to the promised Jewish Messiah. And one day his brother comes along, Andrew, and he says, "Look, we found the Messiah." And so Peter comes and goes with him. And then when he does, so they get there, they show up to Jesus. Jesus already knows who he is. And Jesus says, "You are Simon, son of Jonah. But now you will be Cephas," okay, which is Peter. I mean, it changes his name. I'm like, you talk about eye-opening events. But I want to hear something else. Think about this. We often think of Paul. Okay, Paul used to be Saul, right? Saul becomes Paul, and that happened on the road to Damascus. And so what we all know is that we've all heard it, 100 times about how then Jesus appears to Saul, and he tells him, he says, "Hey, you are my chosen instrument," correct? So we've all heard that passage, we've all read it, but did you know that Peter had kind of the same thing? Now the difference is that Saul, at the time when Jesus appeared to him, was not a follower, so Saul then became Paul. Peter, on the other hand, was already a follower. He was a disciple, okay, when this happens. But what we read is that and it's kind of a cool story. We've been through it. Matthew chapter 16, is where it is. Jesus asked his disciples, he's got them together, and he says, "So who do people say that I am?" Okay? And so they go through and they give a couple of answers. And then he turns the question around. He says, okay, but how about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter, who was known to kind of speak for the group anyway, okay, jumps in. And what does he say? He says, you are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. And this is what we call Peter's confession, okay? Because right after that, in verse 17, then, what does Jesus say? He says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And then he goes again, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And we've read that, time and time and time again. We've all heard that passage. But listen to what he says afterwards. He's looking at it, he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, this is one of these passages that gets a little confusing, and sometimes people are like, well, what does that mean? And what are the keys to heaven? And what did he do? And who's he talking to? And what does he mean? And how's it going to look? And what's it going to do? Right? And we're going to cover a little bit of that. Just in case that's you. For one, I consider one thing. Jesus is talking to Peter, but he is talking to Peter as the spokesman for the group. Okay? He's not just talking to Peter alone. Peter is there. He's talking to him. He is representative as the leader of this group. Okay? But at the same time, when he says this here, I want you to keep in mind, he says, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And then consider that it was Peter who on the day of Pentecost preached a message and 3,000 souls were saved. Okay? It was Peter who stood up in front of all these people, like in front of all of Jerusalem. He's in the middle of Jerusalem, and he stands up before this crowd, and he preaches, and he ends it by saying what? He says that, get here. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, Lord and Christ. King, Messiah, Master. That's what he's made him. How much does it take to stand there and to declare that? That's what we're talking about. We talk about Peter. Okay? That when he says that I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, think about the things that Peter went. Peter was there at launch day for the church. Peter was there. He was the one who was instrumental in establishing the church in Samaria. Peter was the one that was instrumental in taking the gospel to the Gentiles. Peter was an integral part of the kingdom being loosed on earth. And so when Jesus is saying this, it's not just hyperbole. He's talking to Peter, but he's talking to the disciples, to the apostles as a whole. And he says, hey guys, it's about to get real. And so when you think about that, we understand Peter's position. But once again, where did Peter start? He was a fisherman from a little village who gets called by a rabbi, come, follow me. And he finds himself in the middle of events that changed the world for the rest of human history. He was just like me. Just like me. Now, I do want to say, what is the one thing that we all think about Peter? When we think of Peter, we always say that he's what? He's what? Well, he was hard-headed, yeah. Peter had a bad habit of engaging his mouth before he engaged his brain. Okay? He did. He would get going and he was just, woohoo, he was all in, both feet, and then, whoops, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. That's what we always think of. Okay? But I think one of the things is, though, that when we begin to talk about him in that way, I think one of the things that we need to realize is that we look at these individuals and we say, well, how in the world can God act through normal people? Peter was just like us. I don't know about you, I talk out of turn. I say things I shouldn't, and then in hindsight, I'm like, ooh, probably shouldn't have done that. Don't we? The thing is, though, that for as much as Peter was that way in his enthusiasm, God took that and turned that into one of his greatest strengths. And there's a great example of this. You know, we talked about how here is Peter and some of the other disciples, and they're following Jesus, and Jesus, does this. Who do people say I am? Oh, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, oh yeah, and you are Peter, and he gives them all this stuff. And then do you know what happens afterwards though? Because this is just Peter. I'm sorry. And you have to read them together. And he's like, yeah. And then it says that Jesus goes on and tells them what? He begins telling them how he is going to be turned over, betrayed. He is going to then be crucified and dead. And here is Peter. Just a minute ago, what he's doing. Oh, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then all of a sudden we go to, whoa. Hold on here. Guys, would you excuse us just a minute? Jesus, we need to talk. Read the story. It says here that he took him to rebuke him. Peter takes Jesus off and rebukes him. What does he say? He says, never, Lord, Matthew 16:22. Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. So we just went from you are Jesus, you are the Son of the living God. You are the Christ. No, we need to talk because you don't know what's, no. It ain't going to happen that way. And I've always, you talk about events that when they play the highlight reel of your life, you kind of hoping aren't there. I think this is one of them. I really did. They didn't have TV. So at night, they just sat around the campfire and told stories. So what do you think it was like? Hey, Peter, you got to tell the one. You got to tell the one about the time that like you told Jesus how the cow's going to eat the cabbage and he called you Satan. I mean, that was a great story. Tell it again. I don't think he wanted to be known for that one. Did he? I mean, he wants to be known for his confession, but not for his rebuke. I think in the same way, Peter loves to be known as the guy that walked on water, but he doesn't want to be remembered as the guy who started to sink. And then Jesus turned around and said, you of little faith. I mean, I'm sure that he felt perfectly justified sitting in that upper room, and he looked at Jesus and he said in no uncertain terms, Lord, all the rest of them may leave you. I will never abandon you. Although that statement did not age too well, did it? Because later that night, 3 times he denied he even knew who Jesus was. I mean, there are a lot of events that we look through that I think that the people of the Bible would like it if we didn't remember them. But I think at the same time, what we need to understand is these same characteristics that we have, that we jump off half-cocked, that we get too excitable. God took those and used them for his glory. God took those same, what we would see as weaknesses, and turned them into strengths in Peter. And so we can sit here and say that he got too excited, that he was just too headstrong. He would just run in. He would open his mouth. But you know what? I got thinking about it. We can laugh all we want about Peter sinking, but he's the only one that got out of the boat. To this day, he still holds the world water walking record. But I mean, we do. We chuckle at him. We're like, oh, I can't believe he said that. But it is that enthusiasm that led Peter to stand up on the day of Pentecost and said, oh, this Jesus we're talking about, you crucified him. God made him king. God made him Lord. It is that same enthusiasm that enabled Peter to get up when God said, whatever God has made clean, let no man consider dirty. And he said, okay, I'm going to the Gentiles. And he went to Cornelius' house. It is this same enthusiasm that made him such an effective leader, that made him such an effective witness. And so don't ever buy into this, well, I've got to change. I can't be that way. No, what we need to do is the same thing that Peter did, and that is that we need to fully commit ourselves to Jesus. See, I think one of the things, in fact, we come to our decision time. I want to ask you to, there's a lot of things that I know maybe we're like, well, I kind of go off half-cocked, and sometimes I get a little excited, and sometimes I say things that I shouldn't, and those are all characteristics that we have. But I think that there is another characteristic that we should all strive to emulate, and that is the fact that Peter was never anything less than all in. When he was in the upper room and Jesus was washing the disciples' feet, what was Peter? Peter's the one who said, no, not just my feet, all of me. See, I think we as Christians sometimes, too many, we're satisfied with just a touch of Jesus. We want to separate our spiritual life from our real life. And what my hope is that we would become more like Peter in the fact that we would be all or nothing. I mean, the Bible even said it. Jesus said, hey, he goes, I'll tell you what, either be hot or cold, because if you're lukewarm, sitting in the middle, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. We need to be all or nothing. That is the enthusiasm. That is the excitement that will spread the gospel, that will draw people to Jesus. It's not about us being refined. It's not about us being all of these things. It is realizing that God can take whatever shortcomings, whatever weaknesses, any of that stuff that you have, and if you will surrender it to Him fully and wholeheartedly, He will take it and He will use it for His glory. And so I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to have our time of decision. What do you want to be all in? Are you, do you think Peter, this is just, you got to reflect on this yourself. Do you think that Peter would have been satisfied himself living the level of commitment that maybe you're living right now? And this is not to knock anybody's faith. But I think it's something that we have to evaluate and say, you know what? I think if Peter came alongside me, there are times when I'd go, okay, well, we shouldn't do that. And he'd go, why not? And there are times I said, well, I probably shouldn't have said that. And he goes, yeah, you should. He was all in. It was all or nothing with him when it came to Jesus. We should be the same way. Why do we hold back? Because we're worried about what people will say. Why do we hold our tongue? Because we know we're going to say stuff we shouldn't say. And we're going to trip over our words sometimes. There are times that we're going to do things, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But you know, it is Peter's enthusiasm that led him to speak out to crowds that nobody else would speak out to. It is Peter's enthusiasm. Maybe it took him some places that he didn't need to go, but it took him to places that nobody else would go. Will you be all in? Will you make that commitment today? All or nothing. He gets every bit of it. If you have a decision to make, I want to invite you to make it now. If you need prayer, we got our prayer rooms open. Please step into one of those. You don't need to say anything. All you need to do is walk in and say, would you please pray for me? Say, I want to be all in. Would you pray that God would help me with? That's all it takes. If you have a decision to make, please make it now.